A man who lives a placid, unvarying life does not need a Nivada Chronomaster. This fine chronograph has been created for men who move about, for the athletic-minded and the enterprising. In short, for versatile men who are at the center of events. They use their Nivada Chronomaster as a stopwatch to read time differences, as a time zone indicator for diving, flying, sailing, or timing scientific experiments. Men like these are able to appreciate the fact that the Nivada Chronomaster has more applications than any other watch. And how can you not love advertising from the 1960s? Bold, masculine, overboard. This was the original arrangement for the Nivada Chronomaster when it was first presented. Yes, the times have changed, but there was something so special about how these watches captured the time, the competition, and everything that existed back then. Nivada Grenchen reached out to me and asked if I would like to review any of their watches. They gave me the full catalog to choose from, any configuration, any watch, strap choice, movement choice. And of course, I chose the Chronomaster. This is one watch that epitomizes the brand. It's one of their flagship models. And it's also one of those peculiar watches that the brand offers that I really wanted to investigate. Through all of these specifications, in many ways, this is the kind of watch that I would like to own, and I hope to share my enthusiasm with you. This video is going to look at a brief history of the brand and unboxing of this watch, discussion around the specifications of the piece and how it has been faring on the wrist after a week. In a month's time, I will share a further discussion where it looks at the piece in a lot more detail, but this one is going to be more around the basics and some of the first thoughts that have come to mind as I've worn the watch. By 1926, Wilhelm Schneider Nivada, established in Grenchen, Switzerland, began operating a small watch company. Through the 1930s, a big leap for the company happened when a deal was made with Croton, a New York-based distributor that helped import Nivada Grenchen watches into the United States. And through so many dynamic models that the brand offered, especially during the 1950s and onwards, it continued to be a success. But by the 1960s, we saw the golden era for the brand and the introduction of the Chronomaster. Instead of spending too much time on the history of these watches, I will say that the Chronomaster is very much one of the most important watches that Nivada Grenchen ever made, very similar to the Depthmaster. These two pieces represent the brand a lot today. And very often we see Croton Nivada Grenchen or just Croton printed on vintage dials. These were watches made solely for the American market. A quick talk around the packaging and how this watch was presented. I think that Nivada Grenchen knows what they're doing, just when you judge the size of the packaging. Too often today we are given boxes that are so big, so out of proportion, they end up just taking up space once they've been opened. Judging the illustration on the front, I would imagine these are two magnetic fields that the plane is flying over. It's clearly something reminiscent of the 1960s, and it's a great touch. To the actual outer case, it's not cluttered, it's very simple. It has a felt footing underneath, so it's great for surfaces. The inside of the top sleeve is very interesting. You get your guarantee card, which is valid for 2 years. But then you notice that what has been stuck on the edges is a description around the watch. So instead of receiving a booklet for the watch, it's actually a part of the casing. It's a very neat and simple arrangement without any fluff. The specifications of the watch I chose, this is the Chronomaster Broad Arrow that I asked for on a Tropic strap, because I'm quite a die-hard purist when it comes to skin divers, and considering this is how the watch used to be handed out and sold, I thought it would be a nice callback. The reference number, if you're interested, is 86007M. I deliberately chose the faded loom on the dial and a manually wound movement. The dimensions of the piece, 38.5 millimeters in diameter. The dial diameter alone is 30 millimeters. The overall height is 13 millimeters, including the double-domed sapphire that sits 2 millimeters above the case. It has a 46 millimeter lug length, 20 millimeter lug width. This model uses the manual wound Sellita SW510, which is based on the Valjoux 7750. It's a cam wheel chronograph, and the watch is rated at 100 meters or 10 atmospheres waterproof. With all the technical fluff out of the way, let's get to the actual review and try to explain this watch a little bit more. Try to get into the headspace and understand what this piece is all about. In order to do that, we need to transport ourselves back to the 1960s, at a time where we had just left the more reserved 1950s and before we got to the extremely bizarre 1970s. Right in the 1960s, we had this period where we received many watches that fell under the skin diver category. If you know me, I'm a huge fan of skin divers. But what's also quite interesting is that this piece borrows a lot of elements from the 1950s at the same time. It's very much a transitional reference, and we can see just not from the complication alone, but from its overall aesthetic, it all rings true. If we think about the general application of a watch, it's built to either tell you the time, it's built to be a dive watch, it's built to be a GMT or a chronograph. Brands like to have specificity when it comes to creating pieces. It gives you a good sense of direction. It makes a lot of sense, especially when it comes to designing something. A part of the brief should always be, what is the purpose of this item that you're creating? And in the case of the Nivada Chronomaster, or if you read the dial, it says Chronomaster Aviator Sea Diver. It was them basically saying, here, take it all. This is all yours. You can do whatever you want with it. And they left it at that. I see this as the smartwatch of the 1960s because it offers you so much for so many different applications, as mentioned in the original advertising. It gives you the ability of being able to use the bezel, which is a friction fit, no clicks, as your standard chronograph timer, 60 minutes. Or you can use the same bezel to determine a different time zone. You notice under the 5, 10, 15 markers, you also see 1, 2, 3, 4. Move the bezel 1 click or 2 clicks ahead or backwards, so you've set a different time zone to calculate. The watch is a Bi-Compax chronograph, giving you the ability of being able to determine 30-minute intervals. For the ability of being able to determine your average speed or to calculate something, you also have a tachymeter on the outside of the dial. Then you also notice the sub-dial on the right-hand side. There is this red component that's actually a countdown feature used for regatta timing. A 5-minute interval that helps you count your stops before your race actually begins. Bearing in mind also that this watch is waterproof to 100 meters and is in fact a dive watch. This further expressed by the size of the hour and the minute hand. And the longer you look at it, the more it feels and operates like how an instrument would. It doesn't have one specific purpose, it manages to cover an entire spectrum of purposes. What were my impressions like when I got the watch out of the box and on the wrist for the first time? Must say, the first thing that came to mind was this piece is small. When we think about the reissue category and the resurgence of brands and the efforts that go into recreating these pieces, a lot of the times brands slip up in some places by corner cutting or increasing the watch's presence and its size, but it goes against the identity of how the original watch was positioned. Like for example, if you're dealing with a chronograph, you bring the size of the watch up, but the dial remains roughly the same, you end up losing a lot of space. And the one watch I will compare with this, which is roughly in the same category, it uses a very similar movement, is the Hanhart 417. You can immediately distinguish between the original and the reissue because the subdials are in a completely different place, and that throws off the entire look of the watch. This coming from a very pedantic purist, please take this with a pinch of salt. But when we look to the Nivada Grenchen, the fact that this watch has been built to be almost 1-to-1 accurate with the original, it is so difficult to determine if this is new or if it is old. The only way you can tell is because of the anti-reflective coating and the sapphire crystal. The attention to detail that went into this piece is incredible, and this could be in part because of its size. Because everything is compressed down, everything has been scaled correctly. Everything feels like it was assembled with a purpose. You feel it from the knurling on the bezel to the sharpness of the case, to the pushers, the brushing and the polishing. The level of work and effort that went into recreating this watch and to get it as accurate as possible is as good as Omega's quality. And if that's not an accolade for a brand that's just returned, I don't know what is. That care and attention doesn't just focus on the case and the bezel, but when we move to the dial and we see all of those minute elements, things that the vintage purists want to look for, an example like T Swiss on a dial, they've even included Luminova and Swiss at the 6 o'clock position. The typeface for Chronomaster Aviator Sea Diver has been kerned correctly, it's the correct font. The scale and the size of the text is all correct when we look to the purpose and where it's placed on the dial itself. Everything lines up here, there is nothing out of place. That's something that immediately blew me away. The heft, the build quality, the tactility, the watch in hand feels so much more than its asking price. It was then getting it on the wrist, feeling it, experiencing it that way. This watch does feel small at 38mm. True to form, yes, very accurate, but it wears comfortably, disappears on the wrist. You don't even feel like it's there. I was also very happy with going with a mechanical, manually wound movement. The sense of winding it every day feels correct for a chronograph of this kind. I'm also very happy to have gone with the faded loom on the dial, and this is not just from an aesthetic point of view, this is actually for a function. Because this watch is so detailed, it's got so many little bits and pieces, you can lose the plots very easily. This contrasting beige finish brings the elements forward and does make the plots and the hands simpler to read at a glance. I feel like if the plots and the hands were white, they would be lost amongst many of the other details, especially the white print on the dial. Then it's down to the day-to-day wear and tear and how this watch works. Do all of these features actually add to the experience? And this is the interesting thing. I found that regardless of what I was doing, I would often treat the watch differently depending on the scenario. If I was timing baking or cooking, I would use the chronograph. If I was timing a walk or something a bit longer, I'd be using the bezel. Since we just went through Christmas and New Year, scheduling phone calls with friends and family across the world, using this GMT bezel and being able to swap between time zones very quickly also was something practical. So I was using this watch for many different purposes, not realizing that having all of these features on the watch actually made a difference. There were times when I wanted to use one feature over the other, and it all made a difference. This is something that no other watch has given me before, and it's definitely a personal experience thing. And that's ultimately the introductory conclusion to a video like this. Instead of subscribing to the typical genres of a chronograph, dive watch, sports watch, this piece gives you everything. They don't give you instructions about how to use it or when to use it. They give you all the tools, and it's up to you to determine and figure out how to use it. And that is so refreshing given the watch climate that we're in today, where everything falls into a neat box and only does a handful of things. Ideally, I see this as an excellent companion when you're traveling, knowing where you're going, judging the time zone, using it as a dive watch in the water, using the regatta timer to time the bartender as your drinks are being poured. Multifaceted features, you know what I mean? I look forward to discussing my thoughts further in a few weeks' time, going into the more bizarre things about the watch, elements that have stood out to me the most. The Nivada Chronomaster definitely captures the craziness of the mid-1960s, and as far as recreations go, this one is exquisite.